A 40-year-old black single father stood in the snow on Christmas Eve, a cardboard box in his arms. 15 years of loyalty. One revolutionary invention that would save the entire company. And in a single board meeting, the CEO erased his name, stole his work, and had security escort him out like a criminal. No money, no connections, no one willing to believe him. But some men don't break. They wait, they learn, they plan. 15 years is a long time. Long enough for the world to forget someone, but also long enough for that someone to become unforgettable. Arthur Sinclair had spent 15 years believing that hard work would be enough. Every morning at 5, he kissed his sleeping son's forehead, checked on his mother's medications, and drove through the dark streets of Detroit to the Vanguard Industries headquarters. By the time his colleagues arrived at 8, Arthur had already solved problems they didn't know existed. He was a senior engineer, though his title never reflected his true value. The company's manufacturing division had been bleeding money for years until Arthur developed a revolutionary production process that could cut costs by 40% while improving quality. 3 years of late nights, thousands of pages of calculations, and countless prototypes built in his garage with parts he bought with his own salary. His son Thomas was 10 years old and had learned to fall asleep to the sound of his father typing. His mother Eleanor, 72 and battling a failing heart, would leave dinner wrapped in foil on the kitchen counter every night, knowing Arthur would eat it cold at midnight. The Sinclair home was modest, a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. The paint was peeling, the furnace was unreliable, and the medical bills had eaten through whatever savings Arthur had managed to accumulate. But there was love in that house. There were Sunday dinners and help with homework and a grandmother who told stories about the civil rights marches she had walked in as a young woman. Arthur believed his invention would change everything. The day he presented it to Victoria Peaton, he wore his only suit. The CEO was 38 years old, sharp-featured, with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had risen through the company not through engineering brilliance, but through political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and a reputation for ruthlessness that she wore like a badge of honor. Arthur laid out his work on the conference table: charts, projections, technical specifications. Victoria listened intently, asked intelligent questions, and when he finished, she leaned back in her leather chair with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "Arthur, this is extraordinary," she said. "This could save the company $50 million in the first year alone. Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" "I wanted to make sure it was perfect, ma'am." Victoria stood and walked around the table to shake his hand. Her grip was firm, her smile warm. "I'm presenting to the board next week. I want you there. And Arthur, start thinking about what title you'd like. Vice President of Innovation has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" That night, Arthur did something he hadn't done in years. He came home early. He sat at the dinner table with Thomas and Eleanor and told them that everything was about to change. His mother cried. His son asked if they could finally get a dog. Arthur laughed and said yes, they could get a dog. For 1 week, Arthur Sinclair allowed himself to hope. The board meeting was scheduled for December 23rd. Arthur arrived in his suit carrying a folder of backup materials. He expected to be called into the boardroom to answer technical questions. Instead, he was directed to wait in the hallway. Through the glass walls, he watched Victoria present. She had a polished slide deck, professional graphics, and the confident posture of someone taking credit for 3 years of another man's work. Arthur's name appeared nowhere on the screen. Every chart, every innovation, every breakthrough was attributed to Victoria Peaton's personal research. When Arthur burst through the door to protest, Victoria's expression shifted from surprise to something colder. She nodded to her assistant, who produced a folder of documents. "Mr. Sinclair, I'm disappointed," Victoria said, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "I gave you access to my research in good faith, hoping you could help implement it. Instead, You've been attempting to claim my work as your own. The folder contained fabricated emails, doctored timestamps, and falsified development logs. Arthur's name had been systematically erased from every file on the company server and replaced with Victoria's. The forgery was meticulous, professional, and utterly convincing. "This is a lie," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "I have 3 years of work on my home computer. I have notebooks. I have witnesses." Victoria's smile didn't waver. "What witnesses, Arthur?" He turned to find Marcus Bennett standing in the corner of the room. Marcus was a senior engineer, a colleague Arthur had trusted, the only person at Vanguard who had seen his work develop from the beginning. They had shared lunches, complained about management, celebrated each other's small victories. Marcus knew the truth, but Marcus wouldn't meet his eyes. He stared at his shoes, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He said nothing. "Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings," Victoria continued. "Your termination is effective immediately. Be grateful I'm not pressing charges for attempted intellectual property theft." The walk to his desk felt like a funeral procession. Colleagues who had smiled at him for 15 years now looked away. 2 security guards flanked him as he packed his family photos, his coffee mug, his son's drawing that had hung on his cubicle wall for years. Someone had already removed his nameplate from the door. It was Christmas Eve. Outside the building, snow was falling. Families were gathering for dinner. Children were dreaming of presents. Arthur Sinclair stood in the parking lot with a cardboard box in his arms and 15 years of his life erased in a single afternoon. Marcus Bennett found him there 20 minutes later, after the security guards had retreated inside. "Arthur, I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. "I have a family. I have 2 kids in college. She would have destroyed me too." Arthur looked at the man he had considered a friend. "You could have told the truth. The truth doesn't matter when she controls the evidence." Marcus glanced nervously at the building. "She planned this for months, Arthur. She had IT alter the files weeks ago. By the time you presented to her, the trap was already set." "Then help me fight it. Testify. Tell them what you know." Marcus took a step back, shaking his head. "I can't. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He retreated into the building, leaving Arthur alone in the snow. The following weeks were a blur of desperation. Arthur consulted 3 lawyers, each delivering the same verdict. Without original files, without witnesses willing to testify, without money for a prolonged legal battle, any lawsuit would fail. Worse, Victoria had already begun spreading rumors throughout the industry. Arthur Sinclair was a thief, a liar, a disgruntled employee who had tried to steal his CEO's brilliant invention. Within a month, Arthur's name appeared on informal blacklists across the engineering sector. Applications went unanswered, interviews were canceled, former colleagues stopped returning his calls. His mother's medication cost $800 a month without insurance. Thomas needed new shoes, school supplies, winter clothes. The mortgage was due. The heating bill was overdue. Arthur sat at his kitchen table one night, staring at a legal pad filled with calculations. The numbers told a simple, brutal story. Even if he won a lawsuit, which was unlikely, the process would take years and cost more money than he could ever borrow. And during those years, Victoria's lawyers would drag his name through the mud, making him unemployable forever. He thought about his mother, who had marched for civil rights and taught him that justice would always prevail. He thought about his son, who still believed his father could fix anything. Eleanor found him there at midnight, his head in his hands. "What are you going to do?" she asked, lowering herself carefully into the chair across from him. "I don't know, Mama. I don't know how to fight this." Eleanor reached across the table and took her son's hands. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, her fingers thin and fragile. "Then don't fight it. Not yet. Not like this. She stole everything from me. She stole your work. She stole your job. but she can't steal who you are. She can't steal your mind." Eleanor's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp, held his gaze. "You're a father first, Arthur. Thomas needs you present, not destroyed by a battle you can't win. I need you. We need you whole." Arthur wanted to argue. He wanted to rage against the injustice, to demand accountability, to make Victoria Peaton pay for what she had done. But his mother was right. A lawsuit would consume what little resources they had. A public battle would traumatize his son. And in the end, he would lose anyway. "So, I just let her win?" Eleanor smiled, a sad and knowing smile. "For now, baby. You let her think she won. But you remember everything, you learn, you wait. And when the time comes, when you're strong enough and she's forgotten to be afraid, you take back what's yours." Arthur looked at his mother, at the woman who had raised him alone after his father died, who had worked double shifts to put him through engineering school, who had never once complained about the sacrifices she had made. "What if the time never comes?" "Then you will have lived with dignity. You will have raised your son to be a good man. And that, Arthur, is a victory no one can take from you." Arthur Sinclair made his choice that night. He would not fight a battle he could not win. He would swallow his pride, protect his family, and survive. But he would also remember every detail, every betrayal, every face that turned away when he needed help. He would remember, and he would wait. The first year after his termination taught Arthur what it meant to be truly invisible. Every application he submitted vanished into silence. Every interview he managed to secure ended the moment his former employer was mentioned. Victoria Peaton had been thorough in her destruction. By March, Arthur had depleted his savings paying for his mother's heart medication and keeping the mortgage current. By May, he had sold his car and started taking the bus. By July, when the bank finally foreclosed on the house his mother had lived in for 30 years, Arthur understood that Victoria had not simply stolen his invention. She had erased his existence from the professional world entirely. The apartment they moved into was on the 4th floor of a building with no elevator. Eleanor had to stop twice on each landing to catch her breath, her hand pressed against her chest, her face gray with exhaustion. Thomas carried boxes that weighed almost as much as he did, never complaining, never asking why they had to leave their home. Arthur found work where he could. He repaired appliances for neighbors who paid in cash. He tutored high school students in mathematics. He took a night shift at a warehouse, loading trucks until his back screamed and his hands cracked and bled. None of it was enough. Eleanor's condition deteriorated as summer turned to fall. Without proper insurance, she couldn't afford the specialist visits her cardiologist recommended. The generic medications weren't as effective as the ones she needed. Arthur watched his mother grow weaker by the week, and every night he lay awake, calculating numbers that never added up. In October, 8 months after that Christmas Eve, Eleanor collapsed in the kitchen while making dinner. The ambulance took her to the county hospital where the hallways smelled of disinfectant and despair. Arthur sat beside her bed for 3 days, holding her hand, watching machines beep and lines fluctuate on screens he couldn't understand. Thomas came after school each day, sitting quietly in the corner, doing homework he couldn't concentrate on. On the 3rd night, Eleanor opened her eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words were clear. "Arthur, come closer." He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I lived a good life. I raised a good son. I got to see my grandson grow." "Mama, don't talk like that. You're going to get better." Eleanor smiled, and for a moment she looked like the young woman in the photographs from the marches, the woman who had faced fire hoses and police dogs and never backed down. "We both know that's not true, baby. And I need you to listen to me now while I still have the strength." Arthur's eyes burned. He couldn't speak. "Don't let hatred eat you alive," Eleanor continued. "That's what she wants. That's how people like her win. They take everything from you, and then they take your soul too, if you let them. Her grip on his hand tightened with surprising strength. But don't you let her rest easy either. Don't you dare. You take back what belongs to you, Arthur. Not for revenge, for justice, for Thomas, for me. You do it your way, in your time, and you do it right. I don't know how, Mama. You'll figure it out. You always do. Eleanor's eyes moved to the corner of the room, where Thomas sat watching with tears streaming down his face. Take care of that boy. Make him proud. And when you finally win, and you will win, you remember the people who couldn't fight for themselves. You remember what it feels like to have nothing. You use your victory to lift others up. Eleanor Sinclair died at 3:47 in the morning, her hand still wrapped in her son's grip. Arthur didn't cry. He sat motionless for an hour, staring at her face, memorizing every line and every shadow. Then he kissed her forehead, walked out of the hospital, and stood in the parking lot as the sun rose over a city that didn't care. Something had shifted inside him. The man who had accepted defeat, who had chosen to protect his family by staying silent, was gone. In his place stood someone harder, colder, more focused than he had ever been. Victoria Peaton had taken his career, his reputation, his home, and now his mother. There would be a reckoning. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. The funeral was small. A few neighbors attended, along with some members of the church Eleanor had attended for 40 years. Arthur stood at the grave with Thomas beside him, listening to the pastor speak words that felt hollow against the magnitude of his loss. When it was over, he took his son home to their cramped apartment and made dinner for the first time since Eleanor's death. "Dad," Thomas said, pushing food around his plate, "what are we going to do now?" Arthur looked at his son, at the boy who had lost his grandmother and his home and his sense of security in less than a year. Thomas was only 10, but his eyes held questions that belonged to someone much older. "We're going to survive," Arthur said. "And then we're going to build something. Something no one can take from us." "How?" "I don't know yet. But I'm going to figure it out. And when I do, I'm going to need your help." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I'll help, Dad. Whatever you need." Arthur reached across the table and squeezed his son's shoulder. In that moment, a partnership was born. It would take years to mature, but the foundation was laid that night in a shabby apartment that smelled of mold and grief and determination. The second and third years were about education. Arthur continued working odd jobs, but every spare moment went into learning. He haunted public libraries, reading everything he could find about corporate law, financial markets, and business strategy. He studied how companies were structured, how hostile takeovers worked, how shareholders could exert influence without holding majority stakes. He learned about shell corporations, offshore entities, and the intricate dance of institutional investing. Thomas, now 12 and then 13, watched his father transform. The gentle engineer who used to help with science projects had become something else entirely. Arthur still helped with homework, still made dinner, still attended parent-teacher conferences. But there was a steel in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that bordered on obsession. "Dad, why are you reading about stock markets?" Thomas asked one night, finding his father surrounded by books on securities law. "Because that's the game, son. The real power isn't in inventions or ideas, it's in ownership. Whoever owns the company makes the rules." "Are you going to buy a company?" Arthur smiled grimly. "Something like that." During these years, Arthur also continued inventing. He couldn't help it. Engineering was in his blood, and his mind never stopped solving problems. Working in isolation, using salvaged equipment and borrowed tools, he developed an improvement on his original manufacturing process. This version was adapted for a different industry, different enough to avoid any intellectual property conflicts with Vanguard. In the fourth year, Arthur filed for a patent under the name of a limited liability company he had established through a lawyer who asked no questions. The patent was granted. In the 5th year, he sold it to an Asian manufacturing conglomerate for $2 million, with the transaction routed through intermediaries that made his identity untraceable. $2 million. It wasn't enough to buy a company, but it was enough to start. Thomas, now 15, had made his own decision about the future. He announced one evening that he intended to study law and finance in college. Arthur tried to dissuade him, wanting his son to choose a path based on passion rather than vengeance. "This is my passion," Thomas said, and Arthur recognized the steel in his son's voice as a mirror of his own. "You're going to need someone who understands the legal system. Someone you can trust completely. That's going to be me." Arthur didn't argue. He understood that Thomas had inherited more than his mother's eyes and his grandmother's stubbornness. He had inherited the wounds of that Christmas Eve, the humiliation of losing their home, the grief of watching Eleanor die in a county hospital. This fight belonged to both of them now. The 6th year marked the beginning of the acquisition. Arthur established a network of shell companies across 3 different countries, each one holding small amounts of Vanguard stock. The purchases were always modest, never large enough to trigger disclosure requirements or attract attention. 2,000 shares here, 5,000 there, slow and steady, like water wearing a waystone. Victoria Peaton, meanwhile, had risen higher than ever. Business magazines featured her on their covers. She spoke at conferences about innovation and leadership. The manufacturing process she had stolen from Arthur had indeed saved the company tens of millions of dollars, exactly as he had predicted. She was celebrated as a visionary, a genius who had transformed a struggling company into an industry leader. Arthur kept a folder of these articles, not out of masochism, but as fuel. Every time he felt tired, every time the plan seemed impossible, he would look at her smiling face on a magazine cover and remember his mother's hand going cold in his grip. By the 8th year, Thomas entered law school. He had graduated from undergraduate studies with honors, driven by a focus that impressed his professors and concerned his friends. He had no social life to speak of. While other students partied and dated, Thomas studied contract law and securities regulations. He was preparing for a battle his classmates couldn't imagine. Father and son spoke every week, their conversations increasingly resembling strategy sessions. Arthur had accumulated nearly 10% of Vanguard stock through his various entities. The company's value had grown substantially, meaning each new share cost more. But Arthur had also made several shrewd investments with his remaining capital. The original $2 million had grown to nearly $8 million. The 10th year brought an unexpected development. Arthur received a letter at a post office box he maintained under an alias. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar at first, but the signature at the bottom made him catch his breath. Marcus Bennett wanted to meet. They sat across from each other in a diner 3 states away from Detroit. 2 men who had aged considerably since that Christmas Eve. Marcus had retired early from Vanguard, claiming health reasons. In truth, Arthur learned, the guilt had become unbearable. "I haven't slept through the night in 10 years, Marcus said, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he never drank from. "I see your face every time I close my eyes. The way you looked at me in that boardroom. I've never forgiven myself." Arthur remained silent, letting the man speak. "After you left, I went back to my office and copied everything. All your original files, the real timestamps, the development logs before Victoria had IT alter them. I put it all on an encrypted drive and hid it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought someday I'd have the courage to do something with it." "Why now?" Marcus finally looked up, meeting Arthur's eyes for the first time. "Because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors say I have a few months left, maybe a year if I'm lucky." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black drive, sliding it across the table. "This is yours. The original metadata is intact. It proves everything. What Victoria did, how she did it, when she did it. This is your evidence. Arthur picked up the drive. It weighed almost nothing, this small piece of plastic that contained the proof he had needed for a decade. "I should have given this to you years ago," Marcus said. "I should have stood up in that boardroom and told the truth. I was a coward, Arthur. I sacrificed you to protect myself, and it destroyed both of us anyway." Arthur pocketed the drive. He looked at the broken man across from him, the former colleague who had lived with the same weight Arthur had carried, only without the hope of redemption. "When the time comes," Arthur said finally, "will you testify? On record. In public." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here. I want to make this right before I go. I'll testify anywhere, anytime. Just tell me when. I'll call you. It won't be long now." Over the following months, Marcus provided a sworn video deposition and signed affidavits detailing everything he had witnessed. He recorded his testimony from his hospital bed, speaking clearly and deliberately despite his deteriorating condition. 8 months after their meeting in the diner, Marcus Bennett passed away. But his final act of courage lived on, stored on multiple secure servers, waiting to be unleashed. By year 12, the pieces were falling into place. Thomas graduated from law school and took a position at a prestigious firm specializing in corporate litigation. He was good at his job, but more importantly, he was positioned to gather intelligence. Vanguard was occasionally involved in legal matters that crossed his firm's desk, and Thomas quietly collected every piece of information he could find about the company's current operations. What he discovered was illuminating. Victoria Patton had not been content with merely stealing credit for Arthur's invention. Over the years, she had engaged in a pattern of financial misconduct, stock options granted to herself at suspiciously low valuations, related party transactions with companies she secretly controlled, quarterly reports that painted rosier pictures than internal documents supported. None of it was smoking gun evidence on its own, but together it painted a portrait of a CEO who believed she was untouchable. Arthur's stake in the company had grown to 18% by year 14. He was now the second largest shareholder, though no one at Vanguard knew it. His shares were distributed across more than a dozen entities with names that revealed nothing about their true ownership. He had spent 14 years building a position that would give him power without giving him away. And then, in the 14th year, everything nearly collapsed. A major investment fund that held 15% of Vanguard stock announced it was looking to divest. Victoria immediately began negotiations to purchase the shares herself, using a combination of personal funds and leveraged financing. If she succeeded, she would control nearly 40% of the company directly, enough to make her position unassailable. Arthur learned of this through Thomas, who had seen the preliminary documents during a due diligence review. The news hit him like a physical blow. 15 years of planning, and now a single transaction could render it all worthless. "We could try to outbid her," Thomas said during an emergency phone call, "but she has access to more capital. And if we reveal ourselves now before we're ready, she'll have time to counterattack. There has to be another way." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "There is. But it's risky." "Tell me." "The fund managers don't know about Victoria's misconduct. If they did, they would never sell to her. The liability exposure alone would terrify them. What if we gave them a reason to walk away from the deal?" Arthur understood immediately. They wouldn't try to outbid Victoria. They would poison the well. Anonymous tips to the right people, carefully curated evidence that raised questions without providing answers. Enough to make sophisticated investors nervous about associating themselves with a CEO who might be heading for a scandal. If this doesn't work, we've shown our hand for nothing. "I know," Thomas said. "But if we don't do something, she wins anyway." Arthur closed his eyes. He thought about his mother in that hospital bed, about the drive in his pocket with 10 years of proof on it, about everything he had sacrificed to reach this point. He had spent 15 years being patient. Now, patience might cost him everything. "Do it," he said. "Make the calls, send the documents, and start preparing for the shareholder meeting. Whatever happens, we're finishing this next year." The gamble worked. Within 3 weeks of receiving the anonymous documents, the investment fund withdrew from negotiations with Victoria. Their official statement cited a strategic reallocation of assets, but Arthur knew the truth. Sophisticated investors could smell trouble, and Victoria Peaton had started to smell like liability. The annual shareholder meeting was scheduled for December 23rd, exactly 15 years to the day since Arthur had been escorted out of the building. He had not chosen this date. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of poetry. Arthur spent the final weeks preparing with Thomas, who had taken a leave of absence from his firm. They reviewed every document, anticipated every objection, rehearsed every response. Marcus Bennett had passed away 5 years earlier, but not before providing a sworn video deposition and signing affidavits that would hold up in any court. His final act of courage, delivered from a hospice bed, was now stored on multiple secure servers waiting to be unleashed. On the morning of the meeting, Arthur stood in front of a mirror in his hotel room. He was 55 years old now, his hair gray at the temples, his face lined with years of struggle and determination. The suit he wore cost more than his first car. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the engineer who had stood in the snow with a cardboard box 15 years ago. Thomas knocked on the door. At 25, he had grown into a formidable young man, sharp-featured and intense, with his grandmother's eyes and his father's unshakable focus. "It's time, Dad." They drove to Vanguard headquarters together, neither speaking. Everything that needed to be said had been said over 15 years of planning. Now there was only execution. The boardroom was larger than Arthur remembered, renovated and modernized with Victoria's success. Nearly 200 shareholders filled the seats, along with board members, executives, and a handful of journalists who covered corporate affairs. Victoria Peaton sat at the head of the table, still striking at 53, still radiating the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. Arthur entered through a side door and took a seat in the middle of the shareholder section. Victoria glanced in his direction without recognition. 15 years had changed him enough that he was just another face in the crowd. The meeting proceeded through its routine agenda: financial reports, strategic initiatives, executive compensation. Victoria commanded the room with practiced ease, deflecting questions and projecting optimism. She had done this dozens of times before. She had no reason to expect today would be any different. When the floor opened for shareholder questions, Arthur raised his hand. Victoria nodded toward him. "Yes, the gentleman in the gray suit." Arthur stood slowly. "I'd like to request recognition as a major shareholder under Section 4 of the corporate bylaws. My name is Arthur Sinclair, and through various affiliated entities, I control approximately 18% of this company's outstanding shares." The room went silent. Victoria's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally recognition. The color drained from her cheeks as she stared at the man she had destroyed 15 years ago. "That's impossible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I assure you it's quite possible. I have documentation here for the board's review." Arthur gestured to Thomas, who began distributing thick folders to the board members. "But my ownership stake is only part of why I'm here today. I'm also here to present evidence of systematic fraud committed by your CEO over the past 15 years. Victoria shot to her feet. "This is absurd. Security, remove this man." "I wouldn't do that," Thomas said, stepping forward. "I'm Thomas Sinclair, legal counsel representing my father and several institutional shareholders who have concerns about Ms. Peaton's conduct. Any attempt to remove us before we've presented our evidence will be viewed as obstruction and will be included in the formal complaint we've already prepared for the SEC." The security guards hesitated, looking to the board members for guidance. The chairman, a silver-haired man named William Crawford, held up his hand. "Let him speak," Crawford said. "If these allegations have no merit, We have nothing to fear from hearing them." Arthur walked to the front of the room, passing within feet of Victoria, who stood frozen beside her chair. He connected a laptop to the presentation system and began. The first files were the originals from Marcus Bennett's encrypted drive. Metadata clearly showed Arthur as the creator of every document related to the revolutionary manufacturing process. Timestamps proved the work had been completed months before Victoria claimed to have developed it. Email archives, recovered from backup systems Marcus had accessed before leaving the company, showed Victoria instructing IT personnel to alter records and delete Arthur's contributions. Then came Marcus himself. His video deposition played on the screen, a dying man speaking clearly and deliberately about what he had witnessed. He described the Christmas Eve termination, the fabricated evidence, the coordinated effort to destroy Arthur's reputation. He apologized directly to Arthur, to the shareholders, and to anyone who had been deceived by Victoria's lies. When the video ended, Arthur presented the second phase of evidence: financial documents Thomas had compiled showing years of self-dealing, stock options backdated to maximize Victoria's profits, contracts with shell companies that funneled money back to accounts she controlled, quarterly reports that misrepresented the company's true financial position. The presentation took 45 minutes. When Arthur finished, the boardroom was silent except for the scratch of journalists' pens and the click of smartphone cameras. Victoria attempted to respond. She called the evidence fabricated, accused Arthur of orchestrating an elaborate revenge scheme, demanded that the board reject his claims. But her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and the confident executive who had commanded the room an hour earlier had been replaced by someone who looked very much like a cornered animal. The board called an emergency recess. For 2 hours, Arthur and Thomas waited in an anteroom while lawyers and executives argued behind closed doors. When the doors finally opened, Chairman Crawford emerged with a grim expression. "The board has voted to suspend Victoria Peaton as CEO pending a full investigation. An independent committee will be formed to examine all evidence presented today. Ms. Peaton is asked to leave the premises immediately." Arthur watched as Victoria gathered her things with shaking hands. She passed him on her way out, and for one moment their eyes met. He saw hatred there, and fear, and the dawning realization that everything she had built was crumbling around her. "You waited 15 years for this," she said quietly. "I would have waited 50. She left without another word. 6 months later, Victoria Peaton was indicted on multiple federal charges, including patent fraud, securities fraud, and wire fraud. Her trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Arthur was elected chairman of the board by unanimous vote, though he declined the CEO position. He hired a professional executive to handle daily operations, while he focused on reshaping the company's culture. Under his leadership, Vanguard established new ethics policies, whistleblower protections, and a commitment to crediting innovations to their actual creators. He also established the Eleanor Sinclair Foundation, funded with $10 million of his own money. The foundation provided medical assistance to uninsured families and elderly individuals who couldn't afford proper health care. In its first year, it helped over 3,000 people access treatment they would otherwise have been denied. Thomas remained at his law firm, but took on pro bono cases representing workers whose intellectual property had been stolen by employers. He became known in legal circles as a fierce advocate for the powerless, carrying forward his grandmother's legacy in his own way. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, 1 year after Victoria's conviction, Arthur and Thomas drove to the cemetery where Eleanor was buried. The headstone was simple, bearing only her name, her dates, and a single phrase she had often repeated: "Justice delayed is not justice denied." Arthur knelt beside the grave and placed a single white rose against the stone. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. "I did it, Mama," he said softly. "The way you told me to. It took 15 years, but I did it right." Thomas stood beside his father, his hand resting on Arthur's shoulder. Neither man spoke for a long time. There was nothing left to say. The fight was over. The wrong had been righted. And somewhere, Arthur believed, Eleanor was smiling. They walked back to the car together as the sun set behind the trees. A father and son who had lost everything and rebuilt it piece by piece. Two men who had learned that patience was not weakness, that justice was not impossible, and that love, in the end, was stronger than hatred. The story of Arthur Sinclair would be told for years to come, not as a tale of revenge, but as a reminder that some men, when pushed to the edge, don't fall. They wait, they learn, they rise, and when they finally stand in victory, they reach back to lift others up with them.